Let's jump into the first article about self-regulation. All right. Who would like to start the conversation about this? Who has a question or comment or thought? I mean, anything that they want to do to kind of launch this conversation about such an important and large topic. Any concept that really stood out to you or questions about a concept in the article? Oh, let me turn my video on. Oops. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Hi, everybody. All right. So, who would like to kind of get this conversation started? Someone offer some little nugget of insight or question, something. Should I call on someone?
I have one.
Hi, Haley. Yes, please.
So I have a question. When a child is like, they did something wrong. Let's say my child, she does something, she will accidentally hit a child or something.
Okay.
And then after that, if she doesn't intentionally hit other child, but sometimes an accident she does it. And then when a teacher points that out, she gets like, it's like almost she's ashamed of what she did, but that will put her into like total like dysregulation.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
how do you help that kind of behavior?
Great question. And this directly pertains to this first article, which is why it's such a good question. So one of the terms in the article is co-regulation, right? So co-regulation, what is co-regulation? Who here kind of improved their understanding of co-regulation from this article? I know I did in doing research for it and reading about my father's additional kind of some other resources he had on this stuff, and also reading other sources, information about co-regulation and co-regulated interactions. So remember, a co-regulated interaction can be nonverbal, it can be verbal, and usually, ideally as adults or a child has elements of both language and nonverbal or pre-verbal gesturing, right? Because actually the texture and the subtlety and the meaning of what we're saying comes through with our affect, right? With our emotional gesturing. So the nonverbal and the verbal are both equally important with this back and forth exchange of communicative information. So that's what a co-regulated interaction is, where each participant, they create a unit where they're actually, it's almost like a dance, right? One person revs up a little bit and then slows down based on the other person's feedback. And you're constantly kind of ebbing and flowing with different levels of alertness and energy throughout the exchange. And so, as you can imagine, a young infant playing peekaboo, right? All of a sudden, you're hoping they don't get over-aroused and you hide and get upset. They move your hands, they see you, you hope that they don't get overly excited. But either way, let's say they get overly excited, then you have a softer response. Oh, wow, you found me. Oh, I'm going to hide again. So now you're slowing things down, right? So that's a co-regulated interaction in a play-based scenario. But one of the main facets of this entire social emotional framework, I mean, this is, if there's one concept that I constantly am going back to now when I'm educating professionals and parents, because this concept was something my father believed so strongly in and other developmental professionals believe so strongly in, is this concept of co-regulated interaction being the foundation for us learning the emotional components of every experience. So what we're really talking about here is how to get your daughter to truly understand the emotional context of the situation, not just be told she did something wrong, right? And that's how she's perceiving it. When she's being given the initial feedback, she's likely perceiving the fact that she's done something wrong, she's hurt someone, she's feeling guilty, she's feeling overwhelmed. Right? A lot of kids do that. So the goal is not to point out what happened, unfortunately. That's where a lot of adults go. We take kind of the short path, right? Because we want to get right to the end point. The unfortunate reality of doing that is what you see. Children get overwhelmed by the accusation, by the admission, right? Whatever it is that they're being overstimulated by, probably by all of the components. They're getting overwhelmed by the fact that they've either done something or being told they did something that was not beneficial to the other party, or was harmful or destructive, or whatever it is. So the key ingredient is, how do we help them understand and process and tolerate feedback that is not meant to be fully critical? I mean, hopefully the teacher is not just trying to penalize her or be critical, but instead an opportunity for learning, right? So that we don't have this happen again. That's the intent, I think, behind most of these experiences, whether it's delivered that way from the adult or not. But that's the first step. Number one is, when we are delivering this, we have to come from a place of care and support, right? If we're angry, if our face is tense, if we're short, if we're intense, it's going to overstimulate the child. They've already known they've done something wrong. We don't have to reinforce it by being intense ourselves, or adding fuel to the fire. Number one. Number two, the goal is not to tell them what happened. Because remember, everything we want a child to do from social emotional health standpoint, not just skill, from a social emotional health standpoint, means they have to do the thinking. So if they've just hit someone and you tell them that they hit someone, they're not allowed to do that, well, we're doing all the thinking for them. And we're not wrong in what we said, but we're doing the hardest part for them. So the real question is then, how do we get them to think through this process? And it's the same answer as a co-regulator action. If we can create an exchange around the experience, the first thing we do is, if the child is verbal, we might ask them, what happened? Oh no, what happened here? And if they don't answer us, well, we can ask, well, is somebody hurt, or did somebody do something, or did they take a toy? And a lot of times, actually, if we're non-judgmental and critical, children will open up. If a child doesn't have all that language, then we're going to use more gestural and pre-verbal communication patterns to establish a back and forth. And usually we're trying to acknowledge a child's feeling that led to the behavior. If they're angry or frustrated or scared, we're going to empathize with them. Even though we're not accepting the behavior, we're accepting the feeling. Okay. And unfortunately, most teachers, if not every teacher I've ever worked with, and I apologize, I used to be a teacher too, and I did the same thing. We're so focused on the behavior itself that we're not separating the behavior and the emotion. So all of a sudden, we want this little girl to understand how she felt, what feeling led to the behavior, but we don't want to just shut down the behavior by saying that was bad. Because then guess what? She's not learning to express herself around being frustrated, angry, or scared that led to the behavior. So the key is communication. The key is a co-regulated exchange around the experience, not simply setting the boundary. If after you have that co-regulated experience, if after you have some sort of back and forth exchange about what happened, listen to the child, hear their point of view, understand their feelings that drove this happening, and empathize with them and show them support, then if we need to, we can set a boundary and say, but you know what? I get frustrated too, or I don't like when people play with my toys. I don't like it when people try to do this, but you know what? We can't hit. Yeah. And we're doing it now from a place of more love and support, because we've listened first before we tell. I hope that helps. I know there was a couple questions that came from that. Let's see. How do we know someone is dysregulated or overstimulated, or just using one of the sensory processing models to regulate themselves in the moment? Well, they're kind of one and the same for a lot of kids. But the key is making sure that we're not just regulating ourselves sensorially, right? Sensory regulation is not a long-term regulation tool. It is not an adaptive regulation tool. I don't care what anybody tells you, even if you run back and forth or watch your hands for 20 minutes and then you can be adaptive, the sensory model is not an adaptive solution. Sorry, Kathy, I'm just going to put you on mute. So we have to look at what is truly social emotional health regulation, right? What is regulation as defined by social emotional health? It's our ability to regulate off of other people's emotional states and our own. So we have to, sorry guys, if you could make sure your microphones are muted when you come in. So as we are working on regulation, we're working on emotional and sensory regulation. So even if a child is hitting or throwing, and they're doing that because their sensory system is telling them to do that, right? What happens when all of us get angry? We tend to get more proprioceptively seeking. We want pressure. I mean, I know I sometimes clench my fist or clench my jaw. Sometimes I even need to really stomp my foot, right? Because I'm feeling so tense, I need that energy to get out somewhere. But if I do that kind of repetitively, it becomes a cycle of me seeking out sensory input in order to regulate my nervous system due to an emotional stressor. fine to do that as an adult if we have adaptive ways of doing it, if we don't have to do the same thing the same way every time. But for children who are doing this impulsively, we need to intervene because we need to help them learn to regulate off the emotional state of the person, off of the empathy and the support and the care and the nurturing. Because if that can be connected to even the physical experience, now we have both. So what we usually tell parents and professionals is if a child is escalating, if they're getting dysregulated, is trying to seek out sensory input, we have to become part of that. Okay. If they want to throw something, throw with them, right? But make it into a game, not make it all fun if they're angry, but you make it into an exchange. Again, co-regulated interaction. Now you're throwing something together. You're slowing them down. You say, wait a second, hold on. Okay, we're going to throw this one because I know you're angry. Well, where are you going to throw it? Are you going to throw it over there, over there? But now they're getting into an exchange with you. And we've done this with dozens of children. Then what happens? Now the child learns to calm off of your support, your input, your empathy, your understanding, your connection, co-regulate interactions. And instead of then always going to throwing or hitting, now they can turn to people too. Other questions, thoughts, comments on co-regulation? Okay, I'll ask a question. Who here understood the difference between co-regulation and counter-regulation before reading this, or even might disagree with the definitions? Buddy? Does that make sense? It does. I haven't heard of counter-regulation before. Okay, great. So Ella, did you read the article? In the article, it talks about, okay, great. So remember, in the article, I'll just clarify this. In the article, it clearly states co-regulation is a process, okay? Just like, think about a conversation, okay? A conversation, if you define a conversation, it's a process through which two people are going into a back and forth, two-way reciprocal communication pattern, right? And co-regulation is the same thing. It just involves our pre-verbal as well as our verbal communication skills. So it's a back and forth conversation using looks and smiles and nods and body positioning and sounds, as well as measuring the tonality of our voice, everything. So we're constantly exchanging pre-verbal and nonverbal and verbal information, and we're feeding off of each other's information, right? So sometimes the feedback can be alerting, right? And then all of a sudden we might slow things down. Sometimes feedback might be a little too slow and calm, and we make things a little higher energy, right? So we're constantly in this ebb and flow of levels of alertness, and in a co-regulated interaction, the key ingredient is that this happens naturally if we're in a nice rhythm with someone. And we've all had this experience over dinner or drinks with a friend where the conversation just flows, right? That is a co-regulated interaction. The same is true of a child engaging and connecting with a caregiver, and in the first 6 months of life or first 2 months of life, where they're playing little games for smiles and tickles and raspberries, right? But they're doing it in a perpetual ongoing manner so that the child and the caregiver are actually functioning simply almost like one unit. They're playing off of each other the entire time. That's what a co-regulated interaction is. Counter-regulation is a technique that we use actively because we are getting more dysregulated. We're either getting too alert or too calm or too passive or withdrawn. And so we're going to use counter-regulation, like you said, intentionally, right, as a technique to help facilitate a co-regulated interaction, to help facilitate calming someone down or revving them up so we can have that engagement interaction. Let's see. So when we first started discussing, I did not recognize that co-regulation was so constant, not just when there are heightened emotions. We co-regulate, but actually all the time. I feel like prior to this understanding of the process, exactly. But again, people were misusing it, right? They were talking about co-regulation as a process to help someone learn to calm themselves, or counter-regulation as a strategy to enter into those co-regulated calming interactions. But co-regulation is something we do all the time. It's actually the source of our learning of these different affective states. Because when I go back and I listen to many of my father's like audio clips and lectures that he would talk about early in his career and even later in his career, he would constantly use this term. And so even I didn't fully understand it either for years, because I would kind of use it and I think I was using it correctly, but I didn't realize its magnitude and how important it is as a core ingredient to everything we're trying to achieve. And if we can, I mean, think about the premise of everything we're trying to do with a child, whether it be in a speech session, an OT session, or especially a floor time session that is infusing all these things. We're trying to help a child maintain a co-regulated exchange with us, keep engagement, keep reciprocity, keep social problem solving, keep communication going, right? All of those things, if they're working together, are all part of a co-regulated interaction, depending at what level the child is. A verbal child will have language and logic. A nonverbal child might just have gestures and looks and sounds and movements. So these co-regulated interactions are the foundation for our emotional learning. And what my father used to say is when a child is stressed, like a child wants to get out of a room or go outside, they can't have access to the thing they want. He would always say, make sure you engage in a co-regulated interaction around that experience, because now you're helping that child stay calm while tolerating that feeling. So now they're learning to tolerate and understand and interact and stay engaged around that feeling of frustration to get out that door. And what happens next time? Now they have a different interpretation of that experience. And each subsequent time, they learn more and more about it. Now, all of a sudden, me getting out of this room isn't the end of the world. I'm not going to freak out and have a meltdown. I'm not going to get aggressive, because now so now I understand that, not because someone told me it's not the end of the world, but because I experienced it's not the end of the world. And someone was talking to me, or I should say talking with me or interacting with me around it. Counter-regulation is a technique, and it can be part of co-regulation. It can also be used independently out of a co-regulated interaction, but it is a technique that is part of a co-regulated experience. Sometimes we're going to do it consciously, sometimes it will happen naturally, but it can also be used in isolation if a child is just upset, having a meltdown, we're just trying to calm them down, we're going to counter-regulate. So it is a technique, and it can be used in many, many situations. Okay. Any other comments, questions, concerns about this, thoughts? All right.